Hi, it's Jen again. Today I want to talk about how a non-programmer, such as myself, can benefit from using object classes when making Renpy games. So, a little background about myself is that I went to school for animation and did webcomics and graphic novels for several years, and then started working at a library where I took an interest in visual novels, and it was something that I always wanted to do, but I didn't feel like I had the educational background to learn programming. When I started working at the library, I did a lot of troubleshooting for people, and I started realizing that my brain is fairly malleable. I am capable of learning some, fairly basic things, and that visual novels, as far as game programming goes, are pretty straightforward. And I guess the amount of programming knowledge that one needs to have, I think, is pretty minimal. There's a pretty low bar of entry, so I found that also very appealing. When I started making my first visual novel, Soul Union, I learned some of the basic Renpy commands, but I knew from the very beginning that I wanted to have a couple features that are not standard in visual novels, or at least in the default template. I didn't want to have choices in the story branch out from single decisions. I wanted to have some way of keeping track of the player's decisions so that the trend in their decisions would make the overall impact of how the story would branch away. Because I never liked the idea of having to follow a tutorial to kind of get like the good ending or the bad ending based on like one wrong decision. That often would seem kind of arbitrary. So in Soul Union, I had a system where I would classify results leaning towards three different resolutions that were going to all be equally viable. Whether you tried to resolve issues using power, which would be more like direct influence, or if you would try using empathy to appeal to others, or if you would try to use logic, which would be, I guess in my mind, a very just pragmatic, practical way of trying to resolve things. Anyways, so I was going to keep track of the player's inclinations towards any one of these three resolutions by storing it in a variable that would the story would do conditional checks to see what the player's answers were heavily leaning towards, and then that would determine the outcome of the story. And there were some points in the game that I specifically designed that the player was going to need to have to start committing towards one of the three resolution choices, so you couldn't make it to the end of the game without having one stat of the three be more dominant than the others, which mainly happened in Chapter 2 with the way that the furnaces worked. So I kept my, I guess my programming logic like at that level of understanding for pretty much the duration of the entire project. Was just everything was broken down into like player choice, keep track of the player's choice by using a variable, and then using a conditional in order to check to see what choice the player made. And this worked okay in the sense that it was a functional game. There were a lot of instances where I would have some type of a typo that could kind of screw up things, and I had a lot of redundant code. I didn't use really any call statements. I did go back and edit the some of the scripts a little bit afterwards in order to add in some call statements, but there was a lot of redundant blocks of code that I just like copied and pasted over and over and over and over again. And then I would kind of replace the variable or variable check with like a different variable and a different conditional check depending on like what types of player input I was trying to keep track of. Needless to say, this made it kind of a nightmare to go back and add more content or edit more content, because it always seemed like I created some type of a typo in the process, or there was like some little variant of code that I failed to update while I was trying to go back and update like the new content with like the possible player input. It was just a lot of variables to keep track of, and at the time that I was creating the game, it didn't seem unmanageable because I was deep in the logic of the game itself, and so my brain could keep track of a lot of the variables and a lot of what I was thinking of when I was trying to create different player choices and create different scenarios. But gradually, as the game kept on developing, I started having less of the player inputs and less of the player variables, because it just became to be like too much to keep track of, to make a new variable for every single possible player choice. And that's a little bit of an exaggeration, because there were some, I guess, more global kind of variables that would persist through the entire game, but a lot of it was like coming up with like new variables to keep track of with like every single script. I would like new like chain of variables, and these variables were just existing in like all different places within the project itself. So like trying to find where my variable is. I mean, you can use the the find phrase tool in the editor, but it still became like a very tedious endeavor to try to find where like these variables were living and where I might have used it. And even using implementing a kind of map system where you had the game had kind of an exploration element to it, where you had a map that would kind of keep track of where the player is, and sometimes also would keep track of like how many times the player had been there, in order to like not having redundant dialogue be playing all the time, of like what locations you've been to and then like which location you're at. And again, I did this with just variables and conditionals. So when you look at my my like location, oops, this is my new project, sorry. I wanted to show the difference, my growth. If we look at where the locations are, which everything is like organized so crazy that it's hard for me to even like find. Each location has its own label, and then this was kind of what my map screen looked like, where it would like I had to like toggle a variable at the beginning of every time somebody entered a location to say that that's their current location here, and then that would make the highlighted text to show the player like where they're at in that moment, and then I would have to like toggle that to false, like if they left that location. So you can imagine that like every location having these little like toggle on here they are in the correct location, and each of these having their own unique variable. How I could have typos here. Sometimes it would be a syntax error where I'd like put like 2 equal signs, because I was getting so used to like doing condition checks that my brain would just like break for a moment, and I would like screw up on the syntax, which happens like way more than you would think it would happen when you're in the depth of a project. And then when I would have them like move, I would have to remember So I think, where's the moving option? The moving option was just like part of a menu where I would have to remember to have them to toggle that off as being like a true or false statement. But the main part I'm trying to make is that each one of these locations would have like a different variable that I created. And each one of these locations would have like several different variables. So I would have like a variable for the location itself to like try to keep track of if that's where the player was. And then I would have a variable of how many times they had like entered this scenario. So I would have to keep track of a different variable. And the naming conventions did help, like having an organized naming convention for all these rooms where the rooms were like named by letter and by like number and by like I guess sub the way that the rooms were branching out. Then I had them branch out 3 more times. The naming conventions kind of helped me keep track of like what I was doing with all of these like hundreds of variables that I was creating for just locations alone. But it certainly wasn't optimal. And I'm not saying that my like current location system is like perfect, but I just want to show how introducing like very basic object classes can help you to organize your variables in a more manageable way. So in my new project, let's take a look at how my locations are organized. I still kind of have a very similar naming convention for my locations. I have them divided by like area maps. So like this E series is all like the town of Edgewood. And then this naming convention that starts with like the S's is for like a map location of the southern outskirts. And I've created a class of object called location. These locations have their name version of the location in order to make it organized in my mind of how each location connects to each other in this like kind of number and letter grouping. And then the description is what the player reads. So the player is going to read that this location is E9. They're not going to just know this location is E9. They're going to know it as Professor Emil's house, which is going to make more sense to them because they don't have to keep track of what locations are grouped together and what their relationship is to each other as far as like proximity. Like they don't need to know that because that's what the map tells them. And then I have these properties to it of keeping track of the variables that I know all the locations are going to need. So instead of having a separate brand new variable for every location to toggle whether or not they've discovered it so that it can show up on the map, I have that property here. And then to like know if they are currently there, I have that property here. And then for visits, to keep track of how many visits that the player has, I have a property for that. So now when I make the location and map kind of designs, I think that's actually on menu screens. I can just organize every image button that will show for every location by the same kind of evaluation. And these are going to be, it's going to be name.current equals true for every single location. And it might seem like, well, you still have to kind of do it in a similar way to like having just like the variables. But the way that this is organized, for me to be able to leave this project and come back to it, it just makes a huge difference when you start having these variables like everywhere. So when we go to like the location screens that kind of tell you everything that's happening, I can have like this description here. I can just call up the description and then it can just call up the number of visits here using this same syntax. And it's just consistent, and it's very organized. And there's probably even like more efficient ways of using these object classes, but like it just makes the whole project like way more organized than just having like just random variables like just scattered out throughout my entire project. And so I did that also with like the characters in the game for keeping track again of like that whole kind of logic, empathy, and power for like the choice resolutions for the character. I have a similar setup for this one. In this one we have a health bar because there is a combat system in this game. And we also have a similar kind of function for the NPC characters that the player runs into, with them also having an additional like affinity bar. And then we can just kind of organize all of our player and our player characters this way as well, instead of having separate variables for every, instead of having like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 separate variables for every single NPC. I can just have my one NPC and all the variables are like kind of neatly attached to that NPC. And the same goes with locations, and the same goes with objects. As far as like having an item system, my item system is so much better in this one because let me see if I can find my items. Because again, the item has the properties that all the items share, and then instead of making, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate variables for every single item, I can just have the one variable with all those properties attached to it. And the same goes with the locations. And that just makes it so much easier to organize, to have just like one variable or one object, and then be able to have like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 properties attached to that object, and have like 5 separate variables that the program doesn't really know are related to each other. You as the programmer would have to keep track of that, and you can kind of fudge that by like having different naming conventions that are that make those things related to it in your mind, but they are not actually related to each other. And you can totally like fudge, like how I did for my first couple projects, just using variables that have names that make sense to you at the time. They don't have to be related to the properties don't have to be related to the character or object or location in order for the game to be functional. But again, it just makes it so much easier when you go back to actually revisiting a project that you maybe haven't revisited in like weeks or months or years, to have all of the objects related properties set up to be related to that object. So now when I go into my newer project, we have the same kind of like stat displays, we have the same kind of item displays and related text that we would have in like my older game. And we have a similar map kind of system that I had in my previous games, but I know that when I have to step away from my project and come back to it, that it's going to be easier for me to update it and to look at the information, because everything is going to be better organized. And similar to like making directories, like you can just dump all the images in the image folder, and then you don't have to tell the game like where the images are, when the images are located in a subdirectory. Like if I go here to like my images, like I have to tell it that it's in the images, BG folder. But when you start having like hundreds and hundreds of images, like especially if you're working with ATL animations, having these subfolders are worth it to have to go back and like declare these subfolders, because it's going to make your project just so much more manageable if you put the foundations to keep it organized in a manner that you can actually step away from your game and come back to it, because with these larger, bigger projects, that will just end up having to happen at some point. All right, that's all I've got for today. So thanks for listening, and I hope you found that helpful. And if you have any questions you want me to follow up on, I'd be more than happy to answer. I know I didn't go into the actual syntax of like how to create objects because I'm not a programmer, and I feel like there are a lot of other really great creators, YouTubers, and just resources in the Renpy forums and in Python forums that are going to be like way more helpful and concise in explaining how to do that. But when all else fails, feel free to copy and paste anything that I have or anything else that you might see in documentation, and just take it from there. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.